I heard a cry, a future, not a prediction, a memory. And the voice belonged to someone who hasn't been born, but somehow. Dr. Evelyn Hart had always trusted pattern, number, neural pathway, the predictable firing of synapses in the prefrontal. For 15 years, she'd dedicated her life to understanding how memory, how the brain stored and retrieved information, how consciousness constructed reality from electrical impulse and chemical reaction. She'd published 43 papers, won 2 prestigious awards, built a reputation as one of Boston's most promising neuroscientists. But nothing in her research, nothing in all those years had prepared her for the sound that shattered her reality. At 3:47 on a Tuesday in October, the cry came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Evelyn bolted upright in bed, heart hammering against her rib, her body responding before her mind would catch up. The darkness of her apartment pressed against her skin like something alive, something watching. She reached for the lamp, her hand trembling as light flooded the bedroom, revealing exactly what she'd known would find. Nothing. Empty corner. The same austere space she'd fallen asleep in. The same collection of medical journals stacked on her nightstand. The same framed photograph of her sister, Naomi, gone 10 years, now smiling in the dresser. But the cry, God, the cry, God, the cry. It wasn't the sound itself that froze. Evelyn had heard babies cry before, countless times. This was different. This cry carried something else with it, something that made her chest constrict and her breath catch. Recognition, not the kind that comes from familiarity, but something deeper, more primal. It was as if she'd heard this exact cry before, in a moment she couldn't place, in a time that hadn't happened. How do you remember something that hasn't occurred? Evelyn sat motionless on the edge of her bed for 20 minutes, listening to the silence, waiting for her rational mind to provide an explanation. Exhaustion. She'd been working 70 hours, stress-induced auditory hallucinations. Her father's side of the family had a history. She wouldn't go there, not yet. She checked every room by the living room with its single leathered floor, the kitchen where she rarely, the bathroom, the second bedroom converted, all silent. The building itself, a converted brownstone in Beacon Hill, remained quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic on Charlie. When she finally returned to bed, she didn't. She lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound in her mind, analyzing it the way she would analyze data from a brain, the pitch, the duration, the emotion embedded, and that impossible sense of recognition that clung like smoke. By morning, Evelyn had almost convinced herself it was nothing, a dream, a trick of the mind in that space between sleep and waking, where reality becomes fluid. She showered, dressed in her usual uniform of black to charcoal sweater, made coffee she didn't drink, and drove to the university through morning traffic that felt surreal, as if she were watching herself from outside her own body. Band, surrounded by familiar equipment and familiar face, she felt herself settling back into the comfortable rhythm. Marcus Webb, her ex-boyfriend and current colleague, found her hunched over a computer screen, analyzing fMRI data from their latest study on memory consolidation. You look like hell, he said, not unkindly, setting a fresh cup of coffee on her. Bad night. Evelyn looked up at him, at his concerned brown eyes and his slightly crooked smile, and felt the words rising. I heard a child crying in my apartment. I heard it, and I recognized. I heard it, and it felt like remember. But she swallowed them down, forced a smile she did feel, and lied. Just insomnia. I'm fine. Marcus didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. He never did. That was why they'd worked better as colleagues than as lovers. That night, at 3:47 a.m. exactly, the cry came again. And this time, Evelyn heard something else beneath. A voice, young, female, impossibly. Mum. Evelyn didn't scream. She didn't. She sat frozen in her bed, every muscle lock, every nerve ending on fire, as that single word echoed through the dark of her mum. A word she'd never heard directly, a word she'd never expected to hear. She had no children, had never been pregnant, had spent the last 5 years actively avoiding any relation that might lead to that. After Naomi died, after watching her sister extinguished at hospital, Evelyn had made career over family, science over sentiment, control over the chaos of human. But that voice knew her. This time, Evelyn didn't turn. She sat in the dark, barely breathing, and waited. The cry came again, soft, less urgent, almost question, and beneath it, woven through it like a thread of gold fabric, she felt something that made her hands shake and her eyes burn with love, absolute, unconditioned, overwhelming. Not her love reaching out, but love reaching back toward her, searching for across an impossible. "Who are you?" Evelyn whispered it, her voice cracking. "What are you?" The crying stopped. The silence that followed felt alive, pregnant with possibility, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Then, clear as crystal, impossible present, the voice came again. Not out loud this time, but inside her mind, reverberating through her consciousness like a stone drop. "I remember when you couldn't hear me." Evelyn's hand flew her mouth. This wasn't a hallucination. Hallucinations didn't respond. Hallucinations didn't engage in dialogue. This was something else entirely. Something that defied every law of physics and neuroscience she'd ever studied. Memory, by definition, required a past. But this voice was claiming memory of a moment that was happening right now, as if time could flow backward as easily as it flowed forward. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline, and started typing. Timestamp, duration, content of the experience. But as she typed, she realized how insane it would look to anyone else. How insane it should look. She was a scientist. She dealt in observable phenomena, in reproducible results, in peer-reviewed evidence. What she was experiencing had none of those qualities, unless it did. The thought struck her with the force of revelation. What if this could be measured? What if whatever was happening to her left trace, pattern, signature that could be detected? She had access to some of the most sophisticated brain imaging. She could monitor her own neural during. She could gather data. The scientist in her sparked to life, pushing aside the fear, the confusion, the impossible recognition that threatened to overwhelm. Data didn't lie. Data would give her answer. Data would prove this was either a neurological anomaly or something else entirely. Something that would rewrite everything humanity understood about conscient time. For the rest of the night, Evelyn didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen laptop, designing a research protocol for a study she could never publish, could never share with anyone, could never admit to conducting. She would need to access the lab equipment after hours. She would need to set up monitoring that wouldn't raise questions from her colleagues. She would need to be careful, methodical, systematic. At 6 a.m., as grey dawn light filtered through her window, Evelyn made coffee and stood at the window overlooking the street below, watching Boston wake up, watching people go about their ordinary lives, unaware that reality might be far stranger than any of them imagined. She thought about her sister. Bao, the last thing Naomi had said to before, the words that had haunted Evelyn for 10. "You're so afraid of losing control that you're going to miss everything that mattered." Maybe Naomi had been right. Evelyn pressed her palm to cold and make. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't dismiss it or medicate it. She would study, understand it, and maybe, just maybe, she would find out who that voice belonged and why it was calling her mum that After a day of forcing herself through the motion of normal work, Evelyn returned to the lab alone. The neuroscience building stood quiet and most just the hum of refrigeration and the distant sound of a janitor somewhere on another. She gathered the equipment she needed, her hands steady now. Tonight, when the cry came, she would be ready. Tonight, she would start getting answers. What she didn't know yet was that some answers don't set you. Some answers demand everything. The electrodes felt cold against the scalp, each one carefully placed according to the international 10 to 20 she'd used on countless research subjects over the... But tonight, she was both scientist and subject, both observer and observed. She'd positioned herself in the reclining chair in the lab's monitoring, surrounded by equipment that could measure electrical activity in her brain with microscopic precision. The EEG machine hummed softly beside, recording baseline data as she waited for 3:47 a.m. The clock on the wall forward. 3:40, 3:40, 3:40. Evelyn's heart rate accelerated, visible as a climbing line on one of the monitors. She forced herself to breathe slowly, even not wanting physiological arousal to contaminate the data. She needed clean reading. She needed proof that something measurable was happening to her brain during these episodes. Something that would distinguish this from ordinary psychosis or neurological. 3:46. 1 minute left. Evelyn closed her eyes and the cry came exactly on time, and with it, a cascade of sensations that made her gasp, but this time wired to machines that could see inside her skull. She forced herself to remain analytical, even as emotion threatened to overwhelm. The voice was clearer now, more as if whatever barrier separated was growing thinner. She could almost feel a presence in the room, not physically there, but somehow adjacent space, existing in a dimension she had no name. "I can feel you listen," the child's voice said, wonder and relief mixing in words that shouldn't be possible. "You're getting closer, or I am, or we both are. How is this happening?" Evelyn asked, knowing the audio recording would capture. "How can you exist if you haven't been born?" "I don't know how to explain it in your..." the voice responded, and Evelyn caught something curious. "Your time, not..." As if the child existed in a different temporal frame entirely. "I just know that I've always remembered, even before I had words, even before I understood what remembering. You were there first, in my conscience, like gravity, like breathing. You weren't something I learned. You were something I already knew." The machines around even beat and whirred, recording everything. She opened her eyes and glanced at the nearest monitor. What she saw made her blood run cold, and her scientific mind rebel against itself. Her brain activity didn't match any pattern she'd ever seen. The neural firing wasn't localized to the temporal lobe where memory processing occurred, wasn't concentrated in the auditory cortex where hallucinations would manifest. Instead, her entire brain was lighting and synchronized, as if every region was communicating with every other region, creating a unified field of consciousness that shouldn't be neurologically possible. And there was something else, something that made her sit forward, electrode pulling slightly her scalp. The pattern wasn't random. It was rhythmic, almost music, pulsing in a frequency she recognized from her research on mother-infant bond. The exact neural synchrony that occurred when mothers and babies looked into each other's eyes, when their brainwaves literally aligned, creating a shared consciousness between two separate. But there was no baby. "What's your name?" Evelyn whispered, tears streaming down, dripping onto. "Please, tell me." The silence stretched for so long that Evelyn thought the connection had broken. Then, soft as a breath, uncertain as a question, the voice answered, "I don't have one. You haven't given it, but I remember. I remember you saying. I remember how it felt when you chose it for me." "When?" Evelyn demanded, her voice breaking. "When did I give it?" "Tomorrow," the child said, as if this made perfect sense. Yesterday, now, time doesn't work the way you think it does, Mum. We don't move through it. We exist across it. All of our moments happening at once, like rooms in a house. You're just learning to open the door. The cry faded, softening into sight. But this time, it didn't feel. It felt like a pause, like a breath between words in an ongoing conversation. Evelyn sat motionless, surrounded by machines that had just recorded the impossible, holding data that would either prove she was losing her mind or prove that everything humanity understood about conscious time and existence was catastrophic income. She looked at the monitors again, at the undeniable evidence of something occurring in her brain that shouldn't, and made a choice that would change everything. She reached for her phone and called the one person who might possibly stand, the one person whose mind was open enough to consider impossible. Dr. Catherine Moore answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. Evelyn, it's 4 in the morning. What's wrong? Evelyn, a shaky breath. Catherine, I need to tell you, and I need you to not call me crazy until after you've seen me. Dr. Catherine Moore sat across from me in a small coffee shop near Mass General, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in her intelligent grey eyes studying the printout of brains spread across the table. The morning rush swirled around them, people ordering lattes and phone, completely unaware that the two women in the corner booth were examining evidence that could shatter the foundation of modern. Catherine had been Evelyn's mentor during her postdoctoral fellowship, a psychiatrist who specialized in the intersection of neuroscience and consciousness. She was brilliant, unconventional, and one of the few people in Evelyn's who wouldn't immediately recommend psychiatric commitment based on what she was about. These patterns, Catherine said quietly, tracing a finger across one of the EEG readouts. Evelyn, this is mother-infant neural synchron text, except there's no infant present. I know, Evelyn said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup for warmth she didn't feel. That's what terrified. Either I'm manufacturing this entire experience and somehow generating these brain patterns through some unknown mechanism, or conscious doesn't work the way we. Catherine finished. She set down the papers and looked directly at Evelyn. I need to tell you something I've never shared with anyone in the scientific community because I knew how it would sound. Evelyn leaned forward. What, 23 years ago, when I was pregnant with my daughter Sarah, I experienced something similar, not identical, but related. I started having what I can only describe as memories of conversations I'd never. Memories of teaching my daughter, of her asking me questions, of moments we would share. At first, I thought it was just maternal imagination, normal pregnancy daydream, but the specificity was wrong. These weren't fantasies. They were too precise, too detailed, too consistent. And Evelyn prompted, her heart racing. And then Sarah. And as she grew, those exact moments happened, word for word, gesture for gesture. She would ask me the questions I'd already remembered her up. She would say things I'd already heard her say. It was like I was living through a recording of events that had somehow played before. Evelyn felt the world tilted around. Why didn't you ever publish? Why didn't you investigate? Catherine's expression grew sad, distant, because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my credibility, my career, my ability, patience. So I convinced myself it was coincidence, confirmation bias, the malleability of memory. I buried it. She reached across the table and took Evelyn's hand. But I have regretted that silence every day since. Whatever is happening to you, Evelyn, whatever you're experiencing, you deserve to understand. And maybe, just maybe, this is bigger than both. Maybe consciousness isn't contained by the body or limited by it. Maybe some connections transcend the boundary imposed. I'm not pregnant, Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't. I'm not. anyone. I haven't been into anyone over. Catherine's eyes held. Evelyn couldn't quite. Knowledge, recognition, possibility. Not yet, she said. But time, apparently, doesn't care about our sense of secret. That night, Marcus found Evelyn in the lab, surrounded by data she couldn't explain. He didn't ask questions. He just stood in the doorway, concern etched across his face, and said 4 words that would change everything. Evelyn, we need to talk. Marcus closed the lab door behind him. His movements careful, measured, like someone approaching a wounded. Evelyn watched, her body tensing, already preparing for the conversation. She knew the intervention, the expressions of concern that would really mean you're losing and we're worried about you. The department chair called me into her office. Marcus, leaning against the counter, arms. Apparently, you've been accessing the lab at unusual hours, using equipment without logging proper protocol. People are noticed. People are asking questions. What did you tell her, Evelyn? Her voice. I told her you've been that you're working on a personal project related to your sister. Processing grief. I bought you time. People. His expression softened. But I can't keep covering if I don't know what's really talked. Evelyn looked at this man who'd once known her intimately, who'd loved her until her walls became too high to scale, and felt something break open inside. She was so tired of carrying, tired of pretending everything, while her reality fractured that didn't. What if I told you I'm hearing voices quiet? What if I told you there's a child who claims, who hasn't been born, who says she remembers me? What if I told you I have brain scans that show neural patterns that shouldn't be possible, that suggest consciousness might exist outside of linear time? She laughed, a broken sound. You'd have me committed, wouldn't you? Marcus was silent for a long, his face unreal. Then he did something Evelyn didn't expect. He crossed the room and pulled her his arm, holding her as she finally let her. I wouldn't have you committed, he said again, but I am worried deeply. What you're describing, Evelyn, that's not scientifically possible. I know, she sobbed his shoulder. Don't you think I know that? I've spent my entire career studying how the brain violates, but the data doesn't lie. Something is happening, and I don't know if it's beautiful or if I'm dying inside my own. He pulled back, holding her at arm's length, his hands on her shoulder. Then, let me help you. Let me see the data. Let me be part of whatever it. You don't have to do this alone. But before Evelyn could respond, before she could decide whether to let someone else into the impossible space she'd been inhabiting, her phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. 3 words that made Evelyn's blood run cold. Come to the hospital. 20 minutes later, Evelyn stood in the psychiatric wing of Massachusetts, Marcus beside her, as Catherine led them down a corridor lined with rooms where people lived who'd lost their grip and sense of reality. Catherine stopped outside a door marked 347 and turned to face them. There's someone I need you, Catherine. Someone who's been experiencing the same thing, but she's further along in the Catherine's expression's grave. Evelyn, what happens when you refuse to accept what's calling? What happens when you fight the connection instead of surrender? She opened the door. Inside, a woman sat in a chair by the window, rocking back, her arms wrapped around her empty belly, singing a lullaby to someone who wasn't. Her eyes were vacant, lost somewhere between worlds, trapped in a liminal space from which she couldn't return. Her name is Rebecca Miller, Catherine said softly. She's been like this for 3 months, and she keeps saying the same thing over and over. I told her no. I told her I didn't want to remember, and now she's fading. Now we're both disappearing. Evelyn felt the floor drop out. This was her future. This was what happened when you deny impossible, when you rejected the voice that called from beyond time. The child didn't just fade. You faded with her, lost in the space between existence and non-existence, trapped in a memory that couldn't complete itself. How long do I have? Evelyn. Catherine's eyes filled. I don't know. But Evelyn, whatever choice you're going to make, you need it soon. Because that voice isn't just calling. You're both calling each other. And if one of you lets go, you both disappear. That night, Evelyn didn't wait for 3:47 a.m. She sat in the center of her living room, surrounded by dark, and called out into the void with everything. I'm here. I'm listening. I'm not afraid. The response came immediate, as if the child had been hoping, holding on by a thread that was about to break. I'm fading, the voice said, weak, desperate. I can feel myself disappearing, like I'm being erased. Please, Mum, please don't let. Evelyn felt tears streaming down her face, felt her heart breaking open in ways she'd spent 10 years trying. Ever since Naomi died, she'd lived behind walls, convincing herself that distance was safe, that control was survival. By this child, this impossible, beautiful, conscious, reaching backward time, was asking her to do the one thing, to choose love over certainty, to choose connection over, to step into the unknown and trust that something. Tell me what I need, Evelyn. Stop trying to understand, the child said. Just accept. Just say yes. Say yes to the memory that hasn't happened. Say yes to the possibility. Say yes to me. Evelyn closed her eyes and felt herself standing at a precipice. On one side was everything good. Her career, her reputation, her carefully constructed life of rational explanations and provable truth. On the other side was mystery, was madness, perhaps, or maybe transcendent. She thought of Rebecca Miller in that hospital, lost between worlds because he'd said no. She thought of Catherine, living with regret for burying her own impossible experience. She thought of Naomi, telling her she was too afraid. I choose you, Evelyn said, her voice strong now, certain. I don't understand. I can't explain, but I choose. I say yes. The world exploded with light. Not physical light, but something else. Something that existed in the space between Europe. In the quantum field where conscious danced with possibility, Evelyn felt herself expand, felt the boundaries of her awareness stretch beyond the confine of her body, beyond the limitations of linear. And in that expansion, she touched something, someone. A present, so familiar, it felt like coming home. So new, it felt born. Hello, Mum, the child. And this time, the voice clear, present, real. I've been waiting to find you. What's your name? Evelyn asked, laughing. Please, tell me. Naomi, the child said, softly. You're going to name me Naomi, after someone you love. After someone who taught you that love is worth the risk. 3. Evelyn stood in a doctor's office, staring at an ultrasound screen that showed an impossible, a heartbeat, a life. A child who'd called to her from the future and waited for her. The doctor smiled, congratulated, asked if this was planned. Evelyn thought about explaining that this child had existed before conceived, that consciousness didn't follow the rules everyone assumed, that memory could flow backward as easily as forward. But instead, she simply smiled and placed her hand on her, feeling the flutter of movement from someone she already knew, someone who'd been waiting in the spaces between moments for her mother to say, she's been calling, Evelyn said quietly, more to herself than to the doctor. And finally, I answered,